Good evening, everybody. I'm Mark Hanrahan of KREM 2 News in Spokane. Tonight's U.S. Senate debate is hosted by the Washington State Debate Coalition in collaboration with Gonzaga University, Washington State University Spokane, Eastern Washington University, Community Colleges of Spokane, and Whitworth University. Seattle CityClub founded the coalition this year to enhance Washingtonians' access to information, nonpartisan political debates. Tonight's debate is made possible by the financial support of lead sponsors AARP Washington State and Microsoft, supporting sponsors the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Henry M. Jackson Foundation, and individual donors to the Seattle CityClub Empowered Voters campaign. The audience here at Gonzaga University and across the state can participate in our debate using the hashtag WAELEX, that's W-A-E-L-E-X. I'd like to introduce our candidates now, Democrat Patty Murray and Republican Chris Vance. They've both briefed on the rules, and we'll begin with opening statements. So Patty Murray won the pre-debate coin toss backstage, so we start with you, Patty Murray.
Well, thank you very much. Good evening, and thank you to the Debate Coalition for putting this together, for Gonzaga University for hosting this tonight, and to all of you who are here tonight, as well as those of you who are listening in. And Chris, it's great to be here with you. You know, like most people, I get pretty frustrated with the dysfunction and gridlock in Washington, D.C. I remember particularly one very bad year, 2013. No one could talk to anyone. Everybody was fighting. We were facing fiscal cliffs, a lot of uncertainty, and automatic budget cuts that were coming down. And I came home to Washington State and came here actually to Spokane and Fairchild Air Force Base. And I went out to Michael Anderson School and talked to the teachers and parents and students that were there, who told me they were so worried that their students were going to be impacted in their education. I talked to civilian employees who were already being furloughed 1 day a week and were afraid they weren't be able to pay their rent or put food on the table. I talked to Head Start parents that were being told that their preschools were going to be shut down, and I talked to business leaders who were telling me that their customers overseas were beginning to think that our country couldn't function. So when our government shut down, I went to work back in D.C. with Paul Ryan, Congressman Paul Ryan. We come from very different perspectives. We don't agree on a lot, but we did agree that we needed to return respect to our nation and that we needed to work together to bring our country to move forward again. So we worked very hard and put together a budget agreement. It did not solve every problem, but it certainly brought us some certainty. We were able to restore the investments that I heard about here in Spokane that people were so worried about and across the state, and got our country moving again. You know, I was born and raised here in the state. All of my brothers and sisters and I grew up here, and my parents instilled in me from a very young age the work ethic of Washington State. You go to work, you work hard, you do not whine or complain, and you keep persevering till you get the job done. I come home every weekend and talk to people here in the state and hear what their concerns are about making sure that their kids can afford to go to college, that they can afford to live in their neighborhood. If they're a senior, that we have the security for Social Security and Medicare. They've worked hard all their life. They want to know what's there for them. Those are the stories, along with that Washington State work ethic, that I take back to D.C. every Monday morning when I fly back and go to work to make sure that the policies and investments this country make work for our state. And finally, let me just say tonight, like everyone, I'm so appalled by the behavior of this election, and we need to return respect to our dialogue. So Chris, I hope we can be respectful tonight, even as we disagree, and show by example that it can be done.
Thank you. Mr. Vance.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to the Washington State Debate Coalition and Gonzaga University, and absolutely, Senator, I'm looking forward to a terrific, respectful discussion. So we're all in a good mood tonight after that Seahawks victory, I hope. I am. I have been lucky to live in our beautiful state my entire life. My wife and I met in college at Western Washington University. We've been married for 28 years. We live in Auburn. We've been blessed with two great kids who are sitting behind me over here in the first row. Our daughter, Natalie, is a cougar, and our son, Adam, is a husky. I've been proud to represent our community as a member of the Washington State House of Representatives, as a member of the King County Council, and as the statewide leader of my party. Now I'm running for the U.S. Senate because, frankly, perhaps like you, I'm fed up with Washington, D.C. America faces real challenges that demand real solutions. Our economy is stagnant. Our national security is threatened. Social Security and Medicare are going broke. And we're nearly $20 trillion in debt. And now our political system is melted down. Congress is a gridlocked, dysfunctional mess that can't solve any problems. And our two great political parties have nominated two people for president who the majority of us don't approve of. There are answers to these problems, and if you go to my website right now, chrisvanceforsenate.com, you'll find a series of issue papers that talk about how I feel about issues, and I'm sure we're going to talk in depth about issues tonight. But there's one main point that I want to leave with you. Washington, D.C. is broken, severely broken. With all due respect, Senator Murray talks about Washington, D.C. as if she's never been there, as if this isn't anything she's had anything to do with. The truth is, after 24 years in the Senate, Patty Murray's part of the problem. Whoever is elected president, we need new, independent leadership in the Senate, people who will work to bring Republicans and Democrats together to solve our nation's biggest problems. Folks, this election is about a lot of things, but really it's about one thing. It's time for a big change, and that's what I look forward to talking to you about tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Vance. Our first question comes from Nadine Woodward from KXLY-TV.
Thank you, Mark. Senator Murray, you support a higher minimum wage. In fact, you drafted legislation to increase the federal minimum wage to $12 an hour. Many small business owners say Washington's I-1433 to raise the state's minimum wage would cut employment, reduce access to entry-level positions that lead to better jobs, and increase the unemployment rate among teens. How can you reassure small business that they can not only survive if this measure passes in these tough economic times, but thrive?
Well, absolutely, and thank you for asking about that, because I hear from so many people in our state that the economy has come back from the Great Recession, but they still don't feel like they're a part of it. They're worried that they do not earn enough money to put food on the table, certainly not to send their kids to college, and certainly not to be able to just feel like they are strong again. The minimum wage is a really important policy that assures that you're going to work every day and earning enough not to live in poverty. I talked to one woman a while back who had 3 young kids, single mom, earning minimum wage, and she said, I want so badly to go to college so I can get a better job, but I can't afford to do it. I can barely afford to feed my kids. We're better than that in this country. And establishing a minimum wage, and I have written legislation to establish a minimum federal wage at $12 by 2020, so that we can assure people you can have that hope and promise to get ahead in our country. For small businesses, my dad had a small business in Bothell when I grew up, and I know how important it is that they can be competitive with everyone up and down their street and around their communities. If we have a floor that everyone agrees to, that means that everyone can pay their employees a wage and be competitive. It is extremely important that we recognize that people in this country will be strong when they feel strong.
Mr. Vance, a University of Washington study found a higher state minimum wage could have a significantly negative effect in regions where the local economy is not as strong as Seattle's. What's your position on I-1433, and how do you think small businesses here in Eastern Washington will fare if it passes?
Well, I oppose 1433 for all the reasons you mentioned, but really what matters is the federal minimum wage. That's what Senator Murray and I would have control over. And, you know, every Tuesday night, my wife and I volunteer at a homeless shelter for homeless women. And I see the pain that's been inflicted by this economy. People are hurting out there. There just aren't enough good middle-class jobs. That's what's causing a lot of the pain and homelessness we're seeing. So I understand the desire to just wave a magic wand and raise the minimum wage and fix everything. And by the way, the federal minimum wage is too low. It hasn't been raised in a very long time. $7.25 is too low. But raising the minimum wage to $12 an hour all across America, according to research done by the Congressional Budget Office, as Senator Murray supports, will destroy 700,000 jobs. When you make it more expensive to hire people, fewer people get hired. Raising the minimum wage too far, too fast, will hurt the people we're trying to help. Instead, we need to grow our economy by bringing down the debt, having a better program for infrastructure, reforming our tax code. I want to grow the economy. I think Senator Murray wants to grow the government.
Thank you. Let's go now to Christy Goranson of KSPS Public TV, who is with our first audience questioner.
That's right. I have Ryan Berkey here, and you have a question for Mr. Vance.
Yeah. Mr. Vance, Forbes magazine reports that 63% of Americans don't have enough savings to cover a $500 emergency. What specifically would you do to help people that are feeling pinched, Washingtonians who are in this situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Other than physical threats to our national security, the fact that our economy is not growing fast enough to create good middle-class jobs is the problem of this generation. We've had 10 consecutive years of less than 3% growth. That's never happened in American history. And the result is people are living on the margins, people are living paycheck to paycheck, people are turning to opioids, people are losing hope. There's only one answer to this. We've got to grow the economy. We have to enact smart policies that are going to create economic growth. That means we need to bring down our debt. We need to reform our tax code to promote growth. We need to deal with regulations. We need to promote international trade, not oppose it. We need a better program for infrastructure, to build infrastructure in this country and put people to work. But none of these things are going to happen unless Republicans and Democrats can work together in Congress. And right now, in terms of everything I just mentioned, they're not. The gridlock is preventing us from doing the things we know we need to do to grow our economy and help people who need help.
Thank you, Mr. Vance. Senator Murray, you said that you would like to help the economy grow from the middle out, not the top down. How would you do this in your next term?
Well, again, as I go around the state and talk to people, the insecurity that they still feel today as we recover from the Great Recession of 2008 is that they still don't feel that it's been there for them. There are some people who are doing really well, but there's a lot of people who can't earn enough, who don't have the right kinds of skills for today's economy, and need the investments that we can make to help grow this economy. And it starts by making our middle class strong again. Minimum wage that we just talked about, making sure that people have paid sick leave so you don't lose your pay if you're sick and you have a steady income. Making sure that we invest in education and retraining for our workers so they have the skills that they need today. Our transportation system to make sure that it's effective for today. Those kinds of investments in our economy that help our middle class grow is how we will make sure our country is strong for everyone. We can, I strongly believe, eliminate some of the tax loopholes that benefit the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations and use those resources to invest in our middle class. That's how we grow our economy in the way that everyone benefits.
Thank you, Senator. We now go to Sean Ousley from KHQ.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening. A question for both of you. I want to focus on the top employer here in our region, Fairchild Air Force Base. Pentagon officials say the Defense Department is wasting money on excess facilities and needs Congress to step in and close them. Pointing to the 22% excess capacity across the Defense Department, a senior Pentagon official is urging lawmakers to consider a new round of the politically unpopular base realignment and closure process known as BRAC. What will you tangibly do to make sure that Fairchild and those critical jobs in our region is protected? Senator Murray, first to you.
Absolutely. Fairchild Air Force Base is essential to our military infrastructure in this country. It is critical to our shift to Asia. We have to have an Air Force base here that can make sure that we are protected here as Americans. It is a critical base in our work to make sure that we can project our Air Force around the globe. I have been very proud to fight for the investments at Fairchild to make sure it is strong and ready, not just for today, but for tomorrow. And I will fight with this community, which I just have to say is amazingly great. You support your base, you make sure that you are there, civilians support our military here, and that kind of bringing together our community, business leaders, education leaders, the civilians who work there and their families, that's how we survived a BRAC round in the past. With the infrastructure that we have continued to build and grow there, I know that mission is strong and sustainable for the future. And should we have a BRAC again, and I've lived through this before, you need to know I will stand with you every step of the way to make sure that we protect that base.
Mr. Vance, what would you do to tangibly protect Fairchild Air Force Base?
You know, when you are a senator from a large western state, you have to have a lot of responsibilities like this. I can imagine that if you are a senator from New Hampshire or Delaware, there's not a lot going on that involves the federal government. But one of the things we have to have in this state is a senator who will fight for the unique needs of Washington state, whether that's Hanford cleanup, wildfire protection, or our military bases. Nobody should fight to defend bases that don't make any sense. You know, we're $20 trillion in debt. We can't waste money on military bases that make no sense. But everyone I've talked to says that Fairchild and its refueling mission is still vital to our national defense, and our bases positioned here at the northern end and near the Pacific coast and near Asia are critical. So I will fight hard, as Senator Murray has, to defend Fairchild Air Force Base. And one of the things we have to do is have the courage to stand up and talk to the governor and others that the land use activities that are going on near Fairchild may be one of the things putting it in danger. And we need to have the political courage to say no to that. If you want to defend Fairchild, we might have to say no to some of the stuff that's being built very near those runways that are putting its mission in danger.
Thank you, Mr. Vance. This next question is for you as well. Talk to people in Eastern Washington, and they'll tell you that how we vote out here doesn't seem to matter. It's always the voters in Western Washington that decide our statewide elections. What do you believe Eastern Washington's concerns are, and how would you address them?
Well, you're talking to a former chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. I was the chairman during the Dino Rossi election and some other very close elections. I understand that frustration. I live in King County. For those around the state, I apologize for that. But having been the Republican chairman, I've been all over this state. Sometimes I've spent more time in Eastern Washington than in Western Washington. People in Eastern Washington have the same concerns that all Washingtonians have. They want to make sure the economy is strong, the national security is protected, but there are unique challenges. And let me name two. I'm proud to be endorsed by the Washington Farm Bureau because I will stand up and fight for Washington's farmers and ranchers. Neither Senator Murray nor Senator Cantwell have chosen to serve on the Senate Agriculture and Forestry Committee. I will, because agriculture is a huge component to Washington state. The second thing is Hanford. The federal government made the mess at Hanford. They need to clean it up. Everyone agrees with that. I'll fight for Hanford funding, and I will fight against the politicians in Nevada who've consistently prevented Yucca Mountain from opening. That should be the national nuclear repository to take the pressure off of Hanford. I'll fight for Eastern Washington. I think Eastern Washington would do well with a Republican in the United States Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Vance. Senator Murray, same question to you.
Thank you for that question. My grandfather actually came to Kennewick in 1916, where my dad was raised, and I know this area very well. My dad and his family grew up there. In fact, they were there when the Hanford Nuclear Reservation was established. I grew up hearing his stories about what that community gave to our country in order to win a war. And my father was a World War II veteran, so they gave a lot. And I am a WSU grad, very proudly, and I'm very excited about the educational investments that have occurred here in Eastern Washington to help make sure that this economy is strong. Right here in Spokane, the campus that is now making sure that we have doctors and nurses who are able to work in rural communities, making sure we do the agricultural investments that help the economy grow here. I'm very excited about the wine industry that has now become an essential part of Washington State and Eastern Washington. But we have a lot of agriculture here, and part of my responsibility that I am very proud of is making sure that we have research dollars at WSU and our other institutions so that we can be able to sell our crops in a global market. I'm proud of the investments that we're making here in this region in aerospace industry and manufacturing. So as the senator from this state, I proudly represent all four corners, and I'm very proud of my heritage from right here.
Thank you, Senator. Our next question, we go over to Christy again.
Thanks, Mark. We have Marshall Renz here with a question for Senator Murray.
Patty Murray, in your 2010 re-election bid, you claimed that you not only read the Affordable Care Act, but that you also helped write it. Obamacare, passed along partisan lines, is more expensive than expected and is losing money in many states across the country. What role did you take in drafting this legislation, And what responsibility do you feel towards Washingtonians who are now paying higher premiums for less coverage?
Well, first of all, let me say, before I answer your question, that I am very excited that tomorrow here in Spokane, the Teaching Health Center that was part of the ACA is going to open up. And that is a facility that will now train medical professionals right here to help deal with the shortage that we have in many of our rural communities. That was part of the goal of the ACA, was to make sure that we had enough physicians. That helps lower the cost for everyone. I distinctly remember debating the ACA, coming here to Spokane and holding a roundtable, hearing from people who were denied health care coverage because of a pre-existing condition. They could not buy insurance. I had one woman come in and she put this stack of paper that tall in front of me and she said, "I thought I had good insurance until I got cancer. And all of a sudden, I had to fight with my insurance company every day to pay for my medical coverage." And she said, "This stack of papers is my correspondence, just trying to get them to cover what I thought I had." Women were denied existing condition. Young people couldn't get access. So we put, the ACA has solved a number of problems, and we have more people covered today. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. I am so frustrated that all Republicans have said since it was passed is repeal it. I'm willing to work with anyone from any party to say what are the challenges today and how can we fix it. And by the way, one of the biggest challenges is that in some communities the insurance companies have dropped coverage. That's why I support a public option, so we can lower those rates and have the opportunity for everyone to get the health care coverage that they deserve.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Vance, you've said that the problem with the Affordable Care Act is that it creates a one-size-fits-all, top-down approach, providing insurance for many Americans who lacked coverage, but for other Americans it isn't working. Would you work to repeal it? And do you think the Republican Party would be able to agree on a viable alternative without jeopardizing basic coverage for the millions of Americans who are now covered under the Affordable Care Act?
Yeah, there's much that Senator Murray said that I agree with, and one of those things is the fact that my party, the Republicans, have not been responsible and stepped up and offered an alternative to Obamacare. Look, like so many other Americans, my family's lived through healthcare crises. 3 years ago, my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she's great today. They caught it very, very early. But the point is we had good insurance, and she got incredibly high-quality, quick coverage and service, and they caught her cancer before it was able to spread, and everything turned out okay. I can't imagine living in this society without health care coverage. I can't imagine trying to raise kids without health insurance. And we had a problem in this country. A lot of Americans had very good insurance. Others were covered by the government. But there was a big segment of American society who did not have health care coverage. Congress needed to do something. But instead of working together, they passed a plan that's entirely partisan. Only Democrats supported it. It was doomed to fail. Obamacare is falling apart. That's a fact. The next Congress is going to have to do something to fix or dramatically change Obamacare. The difference here is Senator Murray and Hillary Clinton support what's called the public option. That's allowing more people to become dependent on government coverage. That's going to mean more control over your health care by the government and more costs on the government that's already $20 trillion in debt. I think we can do better. I think for those who need help, we can have a targeted solution for those who need help, modeled on the Washington State Basic Health Plan, which would allow people to purchase private sector coverage with a small subsidy from the government. I think that's something that's worked very well in Washington State for many years. It would be a way to get coverage to those who need it without destroying everyone else's coverage. You know, people had their coverage, or, you know, if they can get to keep what they had or don't have any more.
Thank you, Mr. Vance. We now go to a special guest panelist, Caleb Dawson, president of the Gonzaga University Student Body Association.
Thank you, Mark. This question comes online, submitted by Colin Seeberger, and is for the both of you. Less than half of first-time, full-time college students at America's four-year public colleges are completing their degrees within 6 years of enrollment. Mr. Vance, how can we improve college completion so that students aren't taking on unnecessary debt and are able to get their degrees?
Well, that's a great question, and I live this every day. I have two of them sitting over here to the left. I make a payment every month on my son's loan. He makes a payment too. I'll be doing the same for my daughter pretty soon. I understand the debt problem out there. A lot of this, including what you're talking about in terms of higher education policy, needs to be driven at the state level, not at the federal level. And I'm reluctant to start stepping in and telling colleges and universities how to run their institutions and do their business. We do have a problem out there. One solution, I think, is to allow students to refinance, and parents, their loans. If you can refinance your auto loan, your home loan, you ought to be able to refinance your student loans at a lower rate. But really, the problem is been driven by state legislatures cutting back on funding for higher education. Now, thankfully, here in Washington State, they're going the other direction. They put more money into higher education so that my daughter's tuition check at WSU is actually lower now. The real answer to this is in Olympia, not Washington, D.C. But I am concerned that there's a lot of politicians out there, including Senator Murray and Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, who are promising people things like free college or debt-free college. We're $20 trillion in debt now. We cannot afford more federal spending. If we're going to raise taxes, as they have proposed, to maybe bring down college costs, those taxes need to be used to bring down the debt first. The reason why our debt continues to mount and mount and mount is more and more politicians make more and more promises and then just pay for those promises by borrowing money and printing money. It can't continue.
Thank you, Mr. Vance. Senator Murray, your response?
Well, thank you. I'm sitting in front of you as the United States Senator because back when I was young, my father was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and lost his job. Fortunately, my country was there for me. And through Pell Grants and student loans and other government programs, I was able to graduate from WSU, as were my 6 brothers and sisters. I believe very strongly that we have a responsibility in this country to make sure that students are able to go to college and can afford it and don't have to work 3 or 4 or 5 jobs while they're in college and graduate late, as she talked about. I talked to too many young people today in middle school who've decided already that they're not going to go to college because of the expense. I talked to too many students in college who are working 3 or 4 jobs, and I talked to way too many people who are trying to pay back a student loan. I believe we should expand our Pell Grant program so that more people qualify. I believe that we should be able to refinance student loans. Right now, you cannot refinance your student loan. I was proud to support, co-sponsor that legislation actually with Senator Elizabeth Warren, and I was so sad that the Republicans tried to filibuster it and we lost by just a few votes. I'm going to keep trying till we get that done. And yes, we are having a really good conversation in this country about how we can allow students to go to community colleges tuition free. I think that's an important conversation to have, and I'll tell you, there are some tax loopholes that we can close for the wealthy and the biggest corporations to help reinvest in young people so that they can get their college degree. We need them to get those degrees for the jobs of today.
Thank you, Senator. Now back to Christy with another audience member.
Yeah, I have Tim Abbey here with a question for Senator Murray.
Yes. Senator Murray, I'm 63 years old, and for at least 50 of those years, I've been hearing about the need to strengthen Social Security. Why has Congress failed to do this, and what are you planning to do to protect Social Security?
Well, thank you very much, because I absolutely believe, Tim, that Social Security and Medicare are the cornerstone of making sure that people who work hard all their lives have that security when they retire, that they will have an income that will keep them out of poverty. We need to strengthen Social Security so it works for future generations. I actually believe that we should raise the cap so that we can reinvest in Social Security in ways that works for today's families. Too many women today do not reach full capacity because they're in and out of the workforce and they don't pay in enough. We need to look at our workforce policies today and how they impact Social Security and expand it. And I believe we can raise the cap and do that, and in fact have introduced legislation, and I'm working on it to do that. But I do not believe that we should raise the age for retirement for Social Security or Medicare, and I do not believe that we should reduce payments for senior citizens on Social Security through the so-called chain CPI that is often proposed. We need to expand Social Security, strengthen it, make it work for tomorrow, and I am willing to work with anyone who will work with us to get that done.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Vance, the Republican Party is calling for comprehensive reform to perpetuate Social Security. Do your positions on Social Security differ from the party platform, and if so, how?
Yes, and one of the things I've said throughout this campaign is if you listen carefully, you might find my message is very different than you hear from a lot of other members of my party. This is a critical issue, and this issue defines, I think, the difference between Senator Murray and I. We are never going to bring our debt down and stabilize Social Security and Medicare if Republicans are locked in a position of just making cuts and the Democrats are locked in a position, as you just heard from Senator Murray, of just raising taxes. I am a strong believer in the approach that was developed by President Obama's bipartisan commission in 2010 that included Republicans and Democrats, business and labor, House members and senators, the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which recommended we need to do all these things. Yes, we need to raise the income cap on Social Security so the wealthiest Americans contribute a bit more, but that will not be enough. We cannot fix Social Security with just tax increases. It's not fiscally possible or politically possible. We have to do things that the Simpson-Bowles Commission recommended that included responsible Democrats like Bill Clinton's chief of staff and Bill Clinton's budget director to slightly gradually raise the retirement age, to change the benefit schedule, to cap non-discretionary spending. If we don't do these things, Social Security is going to be broke in less than 15 years. And the politicians in Washington, D.C., including Senator Murray, have done nothing about it. And they will do nothing about it as long as Republicans stay locked into their talking points and Democrats stay locked into their talking points. I will take positions that a lot of other members of my party won't take to seek a bipartisan grand bargain where both sides give a little bit. Because if we don't, we're going to face a situation in a very few years where we're going to be dramatically cutting benefits for current retirees or massively increasing taxes, or I guess we could just keep borrowing money and printing money and borrowing it from China. I'm in favor of a grand bargain that includes all these solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Vance. Now back to Nadine.
Thank you, Mark. Mr. Vance, the national debt has grown, as you mentioned, to a staggering $20 trillion. That's almost $61,000 for each American, all of us. It's such a serious problem that former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Michael Mullen, says that the national debt is the single biggest threat to our national security. What is your plan to reduce the deficit? And how do you convince your critics that lower taxes for individuals and companies, which you support, is the right direction?
Boy, I'm so glad you asked that question. You know, if there's any one factor that led me to run for this office, it's the crisis I've seen for the past several years as our debt has gone up and up and up, and the Republicans and Democrats in Congress have done nothing about it. In fact, they've worked together to raise the debt. Last year, Republicans and Democrats together passed a budget agreement that raised our debt by another $1 trillion. And all they've been willing to do is pass cynical budgets, such as the budget that Senator Murray is so proud of that she passed with Paul Ryan, that did not solve any problems, did not bring the debt down, kept the government open, but just continued to kick the can forward. I have been very specific about this. I support a Simpson-Bowles style approach that involves spending cuts and some revenue increases and some structural changes to our entitlement programs. Now, we all know that's what needs to happen. Every grown-up understands that's what needs to happen. But this generation of politicians don't have the guts to do it because they're so afraid of making their base angry. Republicans are afraid of their talk radio base. The Democrats are afraid of their liberal base. And so nothing gets done. And as long as we keep reelecting the same people to office year after year, nothing will get done. And briefly on taxes, I support comprehensive tax reform, which will close loopholes, but then lower rates for everyone. And this will actually give the middle class a tax cut, but force the rich and the corporations to pay more of their fair share. But then, unlike Senator Murray, I believe that money needs to go to bring down the debt, not for new spending. Folks, this is a problem that we have to get serious about dealing with, and electing and re-electing the same people who helped made this mess is not going to help clean it up.
Senator Murray, when you ran for office back in 1992, you said that the national debt was one of your top priorities. Yet, in the 24 years you've been in the Senate, it's increased by more than $15 trillion. So what is your plan to reduce the deficit? Increase taxes, spending reform, a combination of both?
Well, Nadine, that's a really important question, and I think we need to step back and remember what happened. Throughout the 90s, we began to really deal with our debt. In fact, by the end of President Bill Clinton's term in office, we started having surpluses. But then, in 2000, under President Bush, he proposed, and Congress passed not one, but two major tax decreases that benefited mostly the wealthy and major corporations and did not pay for it. And this country, under President Bush, voted to go to war in Iraq. I opposed that war and voted no, but that was done without paying for it, including all the costs of taking care of the men and women who served when they came home. And here we are today with a debt. I opposed all three of those, and Chris was Republican Party chair at the time and supported them. You can't pass policies and not pay for them and expect the world to work the way you want it to. And then, of course, we had the economic collapse in 2008, and we are still working our way out of it. So the answer to your question is important. The first thing we do is do no harm to our economy and put us back in a place where people lose their jobs and their pensions and can't afford to live. So we need to strengthen our middle class, again, as I've said, invest in them, be wise. Yes, we need to do a fair and balanced approach of cutting programs and having every American contribute, not just those who are working or are seniors and retired. And I am happy to work with anyone as we continue to address that serious problem.
Thank you, Senator. Now back to Christy with another audience member.
Thank you, Mark. I have Fiona Sutherland here, and she has a question for both of you.
What is the appropriate number of Syrian refugees we should be letting into the country? Do we have sufficient vetting standards and practices for assuring national security? And if not, how should they be changed?
Well, thank you very much for asking that question. It is a really important one. As we know, Syria is in a very war-torn time right now, and people are fleeing a horrific, we're talking women and children who are fleeing and trying to get away from the terrorists who are attacking them in the middle of a civil war. We are a country who has never turned our back on people who are asking for help. Syrian refugees in those camps are suffering horrendously, and I believe as a country we need to stand up with our global partners and do our part. It's important to know that those Syrian refugees go through an intense amount of security before they ever come here to the United States. 2+ years going through a lot of background and work to make sure that we are safe bringing them here. And I think we're a home here in Washington State and across the country that can accept people and help them come here and assimilate and contribute back. And I know they will be very proud citizens when they get here.
And Mr. Vance, your response?
This is a gut-wrenching issue. Everyone's instinct as Americans is to be compassionate and to help those in need. And I supported what the president was doing in terms of bringing Syrian refugees to the United States until the attack in Paris, and we found that at least one of the attackers had posed as a refugee to then get into France and commit that attack. And then, and actually it was just before that, the director of the FBI testified before Congress that the FBI and Homeland Security cannot adequately vet these refugees. So everyone talks about this tremendous job we do for vetting these refugees, and they go through years and months of vetting. But our own director of the FBI says we cannot adequately vet these refugees. My position is real simple. I want to admit refugees once the FBI will let us know that they can adequately vet them to keep us safe. But let's talk about Syria for just a moment. That whole mess over there is an example of what happens when the United States abdicates its responsibility to help lead. I mean, Americans don't like the idea of the U.S. being the world's policeman, but we have allowed Syria to fall apart, and it is destabilizing the Middle East. It's creating the refugee crisis, which is causing instability throughout Europe, and we have got to work with our coalition partners to settle the Syrian civil war and stop the refugee crisis at its source.
Thank you, Mr. Vance. Now back over to Sean.
Mr. Vance, in 2014, Democrats and Republicans changed the Uniform Code of Military Justice by stripping commanders of their ability to overturn military jury convictions. This was done to address the egregious record of sexual abuse and discrimination suffered by women in the military. Has the military done enough to police and punish discriminatory and abusive treatment of women soldiers?
Well, apparently not. Everything we're hearing is that this continues, and it's unacceptable. It is absolutely unacceptable for us as Americans. I don't like the idea of politicians telling the military how to run the military. I recoil at that. I think it's dangerous. But when you're talking about violating people's civil rights, and you're talking about the sexual assault and sexual harassment of women, well, that's when Congress does need to step in. So I think that the next Congress needs to look at this very carefully. Women are serving proudly and valuably in our military. Our military is becoming more and more diverse. And again, it makes me uncomfortable for politicians to try and come in and tell the military how to do things. But in this case, these are our wives and daughters and sisters, and you have to make sure they're protected and treated in the way they should be treated.
Senator Murray, different question for you. This was submitted online by Heather from Auburn. Women veterans often need to be outsourced to other clinics because the VA cannot address women's care like mammograms in-house. She says we often can't have providers of the same sex. We also have treatment that is founded on data from male veterans and women's care that is outdated. What do you plan to propose to fix these issues?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because I will tell you, I have talked to so many women who have served us incredibly honorably in conflicts around the globe. And we have a responsibility when anyone serves our country to be there with more than words, but to make sure that they have the services they need. The fastest growing population in our VA today are women. And I was proud to work to make sure that we now require all VA facilities to have a women's clinic, to make sure that they have an entrance that is safe and secure for them and that they get the services they need. Too often, I have to tell you, however, women veterans don't seek VA care. They don't see themselves as a veteran. They don't identify themselves as a veteran. So I'm working very hard to make sure they get the services they need. But this goes back to a question that you asked my opponent, and that is the issue of sexual harassment in our military, where too many women do not come forward and tell of their experience because they have to report to their commander. That's pretty hard to do when you're in the military. So yes, we need to reform the system. I believe we need to look outside our military for issues of sexual harassment, and we need to recognize that many women veterans who have served before and are serving today suffer from military sexual trauma, and we need to make sure our VA is prepared to receive them and that our military commanders from the top down continue to let this be known within their ranks. It is not acceptable behavior.
Thank you, Senator. This next question is for you as well. In June, you joined a filibuster in the Senate to demand action on gun safety legislation. You cited frustration at being blocked from doing something, anything, to stop the scourge of gun violence. Since then, we've seen even more tragic gun fatalities in Washington. First off, will you vote for or against Initiative 1491, the gun control measure that's on this fall's ballot? And second, if there still is a divided Congress after this election, as a member of the Democrat leadership, what would you do to create a different outcome on this issue?
I will vote for the initiative on the ballot. You know, it is just so abhorrent to me that moms worry that they're going to get a text message from their school that there's been a lockdown, or that you can't go to a nightclub without worrying, or to a mall. This country has to step up and deal with the issue of domestic violence. It is of gun violence. It's so sad to me that so many cities today are not identified by some historic place there, but are identified by the last gun violence. Burlington, Marysville, we have them across our state, Orlando, San Bernardino. If we cannot stand up and deal with the issue of gun violence, we have not done our job as leaders in this country. So yes, I was proud to stand with Senate Democrats all night long until we got Republicans to let us vote on a bill that at the very least says if you are on a terrorist watch list that you cannot fly, you cannot buy a gun. We were blocked by Republicans. They offered a bill that was actually written by the gun lobby, which did nothing. I was proud to say no on that, but I voted for strong legislation. We have not yet gotten it passed. We have to keep working. We need background checks without loopholes to make sure that criminals and possible terrorists and domestic abusers can't purchase a gun. And we need to stand up as adults and say we can balance the Second Amendment to the Constitution with the right for Americans to feel safe in their country.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Vance, you've stated you believe a ban on semi-automatic weapons would be unconstitutional. In the wake of the recent murder of 5 people in Burlington with a semi-automatic rifle, following many similar cases this year, what limits, if any, should be placed on the purchase and use of semi-automatic weapons?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and we are all horrified by gun violence when it occurs. And we need to do more to keep guns out of the hands of people who should not have them. But I can't support banning weapons that are currently legal and are used lawfully by law-abiding citizens all across our state and our country for self-protection, for hunting, for target shooting as a sport. Now, let's make sure we understand, automatic weapons, machine guns, are illegal and have been for some time. But I can't support banning the types of rifles that so many people in Washington state own. What we do need to do is improve our background check system. Right now, if you're going to buy a gun from a licensed gun dealer, and most people do when they purchase a gun, you're supposed to go through a background check. But too many states don't provide complete records to the FBI. Congress could fix that tomorrow by passing legislation requiring states to provide those records. But once again this year, on this issue, like so many others, we saw a lot of grandstanding in Washington, D.C., but Republicans and Democrats couldn't come together. There were competing proposals about how to deal with guns, and neither side would compromise. They had sit-ins and filibusters, and they all congratulated themselves for how courageous they were, and nothing got done. Republicans and Democrats need to work together to find a compromise on guns, just like they do on every other issue. And it's just not happening right now. And re-electing the same people who can't get this job done now, to me, makes no sense. I'll work with Republicans and Democrats to strengthen our background check system. That is legislation that can actually pass. A ban on rifles is not going to pass.
Thank you, Mr. Vance. Now back over to Christy.
Mr. Vance, Washington is one of the most trade-dependent states in the United States. Do you support the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Deal, a Pacific Rim trade agreement to lower barriers to trade among its partners?
I do. And one of the things that concerns me the most is that both parties are turning against trade. I hear it everywhere I go. Both Republicans and Democrats are coming out opposed to the TPP and against trade agreements in general. I just think it's economic suicide, and there's so many myths and so much misinformation out there about our various trade deals. Let's be clear about this. Being opposed to trade, it will destroy Washington's economy wherever I go, whether it's Janicki Industries in Cedro-Woolley or Anderson Hay in Ellensburg. Washington's employers and farmers and manufacturers are dependent on exporting their products, and these agreements are good for Washington state. The TPP will eliminate, not just lower, eliminate 18,000 different taxes on American products. It will lower the taxes on Washington wheat by 30% and Washington salmon by 30%. It'll make it more, our products more competitive, creating American jobs, especially here in Washington state. This is one of the reasons why I can't support Hillary Clinton. She used to support trade. She used to support the TPP, but now under pressure from her liberal base, she's opposing it. And Senator Murray now says she might not vote for TPP. I just think this is crazy. Trade deals are good for Washington state. They're good for the American economy. We need to stop all the misinformation, and we need to support trade agreements that are going to create American jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Vance. Senator Murray, have you made up your mind whether you're going to support the TPP?
Well, here in Washington state, trade is very important to our economy. What we grow, what we make, what we manufacture has to be sold in markets across the world. We need fair rules as we try to sell our products overseas, and we need to make sure that they are strong, that there's enforcement, that we do protect the values of Washington state about our environment and our labor laws and other issues that are critical to us. So when I get a trade agreement, I evaluate it based on, is it good for Washington state's workers and our economy? Can it be enforced? And is it a strong agreement for all of us? At this point, the Republican leaders in the Senate and House have said they are not going to send the TPP to us. But if they do, those are the values and priorities that I will assess it on to make sure we are making a good decision for Washington State. And by the way, they're talking about changes to it. So for any of us to say we're going to take a vote on it without having read it is not doing what we should do our homework on. I come home, I listen to my constituents, and I will, when the trade agreement is sent to me, to make sure I evaluate it, that it works well for the state of Washington. And one of the issues that is extremely important to us here are those enforcement provisions. It's not just the trade agreement, it's making sure that the federal government has the money to make sure we have enforcement officers so it does work as it intended. So that is how I will evaluate that when it is sent to us.
Thank you, Senator Murray. This next question is for you as well. Between 2014 and 2015, Washington lost more than 1 million acres in catastrophic wildfires. Much of that was U.S. Forest Service land. Experts say that land is not being managed properly, or at least at adequate levels, to prevent the wildfires that have devastated communities. Too often, states have to use money set aside for prevention to fight the massive wildfires, otherwise known as fire borrowing. What would you do in Congress to better fund preventative measures?
That is really an important question for our state because we have been devastated by wildfires. People have lost their homes. A lot of our land has been devastated by this, and we need to make sure that we are protecting people and have the resources should these wildfires hit us. And that has become more and more difficult as the federal government has cut budgets back. It's one of the reasons it's so important that I worked with Paul Ryan to get a budget deal put together and move that forward so there was some certainty. You asked about the issue of fire borrowing. We cannot continue to do that, and I am working with a number of other senators to fix that so we have the funds available when these fires occur. I've also worked with a number of the communities that were impacted. They are usually rural communities, and our laws covering the assistance that many of the homeowners get just doesn't work in a rural community. So I've actually just introduced legislation, and I'm working to change the dynamics so that people who live in rural communities can get the support they need.
Thank you, Senator. Same question to you, Mr. Vance.
And the answer is simply we need to put more money into prevention so we prevent the fire borrowing. Everyone I've talked to says that's what needs to be done. But these communities have been making this case for a very, very long time. Why has it taken these catastrophic fires to get Senator Murray and Senator Cantwell to take action on this? We need to have senators in Washington, D.C. who will focus on the entire state, including on the needs of rural areas. And the rural landowners that I've talked to for years have been making the case loud and clear. We need to have the funds available for prevention. We need to manage these lands to reduce the amount of fuels on the ground that's going to fuel these wildfires. And they do not feel like that their representatives in the U.S. Senate have been listening to them. It took a few really terrible fires to get this change. Again, I look forward to working closely with Congressman Reichert and Congressman Newhouse and Congressman Kathy McMorris to better pay attention to the needs of Eastern Washington all the time, not just after a crisis.
Thank you, sir. Well, it is that time now for closing statements, and Senator Murray, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you. This has been a great discussion, and I again want to thank our moderators and everyone here and Chris for joining us. You heard some things we agree on. Congress doesn't work always as well as we want it to. You heard some of the things we disagree on. I believe that we can grow our economy by investing in our middle class and helping our country to be strong again. People often ask me, why do you do this? Why do you keep, it's so angry out there. It's such a divisive time. Well, as I was coming over here yesterday, I went through SeaTac Airport, and there was an honor flight about to be taken off with about 50 veterans, World War II and Korean veterans, and I stopped and I walked through them to thank them for their service. And a 100-year-old veteran who served in World War II, I said, thank you for your service. And he looked at me and he said, no, thank you for your service. Keep fighting. That's why I do what I do for people like that veteran. Or the veteran here in Spokane by the name of Sean Halstead, an airman, severely injured, so severe that he couldn't have children. The VA denied his ability to get access to fertility treatments. I went to work with Sean and other veterans like him who lost their ability to fulfill their dream of having a family. We fought for years, and I'm proud to say that 2 weeks ago, we passed legislation, it is signed into law so that Sean and other veterans can have that family dream. That's why I do what I do, so I can fight for issues big and small for people here from veterans on, and make sure that I worked respectfully, and I hope we can all raise the level of respect. That's what our service members and veterans expect. It certainly is what we can do as a country.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Vance.
Well, thank you again to the Washington State Debate Coalition, Gonzaga University, and you, Senator Murray. This has been a great discussion, and I'm already looking forward to our next debate next Sunday night in Redmond at the Microsoft campus. You know, we're all lucky to live in the United States of America, the greatest nation in the history of the world. There is nothing a free people can't accomplish if their government just gives them the tools and opportunities to succeed and then gets the heck out of the way. But for too long now, our leaders have been letting us down, and it is the fault of both parties in Congress. Our national security is threatened, our economy is stagnant, Social Security and Medicare are going broke, we're nearly $20 trillion in debt. And as we've heard tonight, Patty Murray and the Washington, D.C. establishment, they have no idea how to fix this other than to blame the other party for everything that's going on. We can fix this, but we can't continue to accept politics as usual and excuses. This election must bring change, and re-electing the same people year after year, decade after decade, will not change anything. If you want change, you've got to vote for change. I'll be a different kind of senator. I'll work every day to change the culture in Washington, D.C., to bring Republicans and Democrats together to solve the biggest problems. I will be an independent voice and never anyone's rubber stamp. And I'd be honored to have your vote. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you, Mr. Vance. Please join me in thanking our candidates tonight. Also want to say thank you to our debate hosts, Gonzaga University, Washington State University, Spokane, Eastern Washington University, Community Colleges of Spokane, and Whitworth University. Thanks also to Seattle CityClub and our sponsors, AARP Washington State, Microsoft, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Henry M. Jackson Foundation. On behalf of all of us here, including the Washington State Debate Bulletin, thank you for joining us. Have a good night.